Hello everyone and welcome to Aunty Monkey. I'm Andrew Robertson and this is the 8th episode of the Ballooning podcast. Before I introduce our guest today, I really just wanted to thank everyone for all the support you've been giving to Aunty Monkey. We've been really overwhelmed and happy with the amount of feedback, the number of downloads, and just the general support that you've been giving to us for Aunty Monkey. Adam and I caught up last weekend to do a bit of ballooning, but we also sat down and talked about the future of the podcast and some of the things that we can do going forward. And we've got some pretty exciting ideas and definitely a great list of guests lined up to include in some of our episodes in the future. So to the guest today, he probably doesn't need much of an introduction because I think most people in ballooning will know who Brian Jones is. For those few that don't, Brian, along with Bertrand Piccard, were the first people to fly around the world non-stop in a balloon. So in 1999, they took off from Chateau d'Ay in a Rosier balloon, and after 20 days of sitting in a pressurized capsule dealing with all sorts of excitement, they landed in the desert of Egypt and were able to claim the title of the first men to circumnavigate the world in a balloon. So Brian's a person I've always wanted to meet, and I've definitely had a million questions I wanted to ask him. So today's episode is quite long, but once you listen to it, you'll kind of agree with me. There's so much more I could have asked him, and I'm sure we can probably bring him back for a repeat episode later on. One thing to note is that there is a documentary about their monumental flight, and I've included that as a YouTube video on the show notes within auntymonkey.com. So if you go to the episode 8 page, you'll see there's a whole lot of information about Brian, but also that documentary that's well worth a watch if you're really interested to see what went on in those 20 days and what was happening leading up to it and after the flight. Anyway, that's enough from me, and here is my conversation with Brian Jones. Welcome, Brian Jones, to Aunty Monkey. Thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Okay, it's a pleasure.
One thing I have to say is, well, for me at least, it's now Montgolfier Day. I know it's a few hours before it hits the UK, but happy Montgolfier Day as well. I guess it's very appropriate we're talking about ballooning on such an important day.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you for that.
Well, today there's a lot that we want to go through. You've obviously had a fairly exciting life within ballooning, and we will get to talk about the monumental flight around the world. But before that, I'd love to sort of have a chat about some of your background, about your sort of where you're brought up and how you kind of got into the love of aviation.
Sure. I was actually born and bred in Bristol, not too far from the Cameron factory as it is, but I knew absolutely nothing about ballooning until much later on in life, actually. But yeah, I was a fairly outdoor kid, I guess. You know, in as much as I was in the Cubs and then the Scouts and then the Air Training Corps, and so I was always an outdoor activities kind of person, but I'd never classify myself as a sportsman. And whilst I kind of enjoyed outdoor activities, I was never particularly good at anything. And I guess like most teenagers, one has a fairly poor sort of poor self-esteem, I guess, because I wasn't particularly great at anything, although I would try most things, but I didn't feel anything for it really. And then when I was in the Air Training Corps, I flew a glider for the first time when I was probably 15, and immediately I was in the air, I just knew that was my I just had an affinity for just being there. There was something. It's very difficult to put a finger on, but it was something that, bit like an epiphany, I suppose. That I really, really enjoyed it and just felt completely comfortable, much more comfortable than on the water or rock climbing or anything like that. And so that was it for me, really. And I joined the Air Force when I was 17 and a half, naively joining and doing what the recruiter told me. But so it took me a year or two in the Air Force because they said, oh yeah, come in, you know, you don't need any qualifications, and I hadn't been that clever at school particularly. And then when I got into the Air Force, assuming that I could easily become a pilot. It wasn't quite so straightforward as that.
I was about to say, it doesn't sound very confident building when they say you don't need any qualifications to join the Air Force.
Yeah, exactly. And so once I was in the Air Force, I realized my earlier naivety. And so I studied and got 6 exams and then applied for aircrew. And in those days, probably for a pilot, you needed a university degree, which I was never going to get at that stage. And so I volunteered to be a loadmaster on Hercules.
And how long were you involved in doing that, working on the Hercules?
Well, I was in the Air Force for 12 years, and I spent 6 flying the Hercules, and then transferred to Puma helicopters.
And was that based in the UK, or were you sort of deployed?
Yeah, it was all UK based, but of course we went all over the place. And operationally, I suppose, on the Hercules, I was operational in Cyprus. The Vietnam War was still going on then, and I guess my claim to fame at that point was the fact that we sent an RAF crew in to get the British Embassy staff out of Phnom Penh. At a particularly difficult time in the Vietnam War. So I saw some excitement. And then when I transferred to helicopters, Northern Ireland was at its worst period. That was in the 70s. Mm-hmm. And that was fairly exciting. I mean, I just loved flying, and I loved the job, to be honest, although Ireland was a bit tense at times. But we had, I just enjoyed it.
And did you continue your gliding during that period, or?
No, I was too busy actually. But I left the Air Force. That was a big decision I took, at the age of 30, whether to stay in or go out and try my hand at civilian life. And so I left the Air Force. And as soon as I left, I went back to the Air Training Corps as an instructor, and then picked up gliding again very quickly and became a gliding instructor with the Air Cadets.
And in terms of your gliding, did you do any sort of competition glidings, or was it purely sort of joy flights and instructional work that you're doing?
No, it was purely teaching. Yeah, just teaching the Air Cadets.
So you didn't have the desires to fly halfway across the country and hope that somebody picks you up at the other end?
Well, actually, I did. I mean, we had the opportunity to fly in different places in order to get our various badges. You get the C, and you get silver distance, and gold, and ultimately diamond, which I was never going to achieve. But and that went on for a while, really. And after about 10 years, I'd started my own company. I'd done several jobs, actually, leaving the Air Force, and eventually I started my own company. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have a lot of money, but I did have some spare money. And so I decided that I was going to buy myself a glider and get into a little bit more competitive form of the sport. And then ballooning got in the way. And so the money I'd saved up for a glider, I spent on buying a balloon. And that was just a pure fluke. It was a time, a girlfriend of mine, actually, her boss had been invited to fly a balloon in the Bristol Fiesta, and that was in 1985. And I don't think I'd ever seen a hot air balloon, actually, at that stage. And so her boss didn't want to go, and she said, would I like to go? And that was it, one flight at the Bristol Balloon Fiesta, and I was completely hooked. It was just amazing. I mean, it was sociable, so the gliding was great, but it's a very, insular sport. You're up there on your own if you're flying competitions.
Sure, yes.
So, and it was just so sociable. I mean, the pilot I flew with was an Irish barrister, actually, and his crew were just great fun. And they, as a passenger, they kind of took me into the fold, and we just had a really good time at the Fiesta weekend.
You met a whole lot of different crazy people in ballooning, opposed to gliding pilots who are all crazy as well, in a different way.
Yeah, I did. It was quite interesting, actually, getting into ballooning, because in those days there was still quite a lot of eccentrics flying balloons.
Oh, there still is.
And there was very little, I don't know, I found it a bit, I mean, great fun, but a little bit unprofessional in a lot of ways. And I suppose, I'm not condemning it and I'm not criticizing it, but it was me having done 12 years flying in the Air Force, having been teaching air cadets to fly balloons, and I found I had a bit of a different outlook than most balloon pilots I met, other than the examiners, of course.
It's funny you say that, because the previous episode we just interviewed Kay Turnbull, and she was telling us the history of her 50 years of ballooning and the stories of what was happening. I mean, it was certainly, probably 10, 20 years before you're now talking about it, but it certainly was the Wild West in UK ballooning at that time.
It was, absolutely it was. And so I thought that I had something to offer from my experience. And so I bought a balloon. I was flying by the time summer '86 came. I had my own balloon, and I checked out and I was flying it. And then about 18 months later, I think, I became an instructor. And then by the end of the '80s, I was an examiner.
So during those early days of ballooning, what was your sort of main passion around it? Was there sort of particular aspects that really you enjoyed more? I mean, you mentioned the solidarity of gliding. Was it the social part, or was there other things that really attracted you to the sport?
Well, it was just a lot of fun. I mean, because it was sociable, because there were other people around, because, it wasn't common to fly just on your own in those days, your own balloon. It was, you usually get together with a couple of other balloons, and there were several locally, of course, because I lived near Bristol, so there were loads of balloons around. So we used to fly weekends and balloon meets and that kind of stuff. Well, I hadn't been involved in anything like that before, so it was just, it was a lot of fun, but there's something kind of special about balloons, particularly if you've been flying other things. And when you're flying fixed wing, or when you're flying gliders perhaps not so much, but certainly fixed wing, you are in total control. You know where you're going to go, you know where you've been, you're going to take off from a lump of concrete or a piece of grass, and you're going to fly directly under complete control to another bit of concrete, and you're going to put it down exactly as your checklists and manuals tell you that you're going to do it. And it's all very kind of regimented and, predictable. Whereas ballooning is completely the opposite sense. It's totally unpredictable, of course, when you take off. And although you have a reasonable idea of a direction, you have absolutely no idea of what conditions you're going to, or where you're going to actually land. And it was that kind of unpredictability that I really found fascinating as a professional aviator, if you like, to some extent.
Well, on that, I mean, you mentioned earlier that you weren't, as a child, a sporty child, but you enjoyed the outdoors. Would you describe yourself as having been an adventurous sort of person that enjoyed that unpredictability and off on adventures every time you're doing things?
Well, I always kind of shy away from the term adventurer. I mean, a lot of people use it now, of course, because I've flown around the world, but I'm really not. I mean, I really am not. And I was probably more adventurous than most kids, but I'd have a go at stuff, and got stuck in caves and things, but then hated it. Yeah. But I wouldn't say I was exceptional.
So during those ballooning, and when I say, I guess the earlier days of your ballooning, so I guess before you started doing the round the world adventures, well, not adventures, experiences, we'll call them. Were there any sort of major flights that you started to do? Like, were you interested in breaking records or doing interesting flights other than fiestas, etc.?
Well, I really enjoyed instructing, and I kind of made it my goal to. I mean, I was instrumental when I became an instructor initially, and that was in '87, I suppose. '89 I became an examiner, and then shortly after that I became the training officer of the BBAC, which basically is chief flying instructor, if you like, in the UK. So it would be my job to train instructors and also go through the selection process and that sort of thing. And that was when we really got to grips with a flight manual for pilots, a training manual for pilots. And it had been started before I took over, but I kind of enhanced it a bit and then came up with a training manual for instructors and a training manual for examiners. And so we tried to formalize a lot of stuff. And I tried as an instructor to get rid of bad habits, because of course in those days, most pilots were being trained by one of these eccentrics who'd been flying for 10 years before I even started, and had the most appallingly bad habits. I mean, it's just even these days, some of the things you see on the launch site are quite amusing, if not downright dangerous. But in those days, it was horrendous to see sort of balloons flying off towards this huge black cloud, or not inflating properly without a quick release, and then a bit of false lift, and off they go bouncing across the field and bashing into a Land Rover on its way to get airborne. All that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I certainly some of my earliest childhood memories are people dragging Volkswagen vans across launch sites because they have handbrakes on and things like that. So I think that was a similar theme throughout the late 80s in most countries, was just cleaning up the behaviour and some of the bad habits.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, it all changed at the end of the 80s. In '89 in the UK, a commercial pilot's license became available for ballooning, and suddenly people could make money by flying passengers. And ballooning changed dramatically then, at the end of the 80s. And I was relatively well placed then because I had my commercial license. I was also an examiner. And when this cropped up, there were a lot of people who were not balloonists who were starting up passenger ride companies and were looking for, they had to have a chief pilot on their books and ops manager and that kind of stuff. And so I started doing that, and I was chief pilot, I think, for 4 startup companies between '89 and '91. And so I was doing quite a bit of passenger flying then.
And during that period, did you ever get into gas ballooning, or was it purely hot air ballooning that you were doing?
No, it was just hot air ballooning. There were very few gas balloon pilots around at that time. I mean, there were a couple, but trying to get your hands on a gas balloon in this country, forget it.
And they were the real eccentrics that were doing that.
Yeah, but they were also, there were some amazing names in there. So Joseph Starkbaum in Switzerland, and some of the early Gordon Bennett pilots were just pretty cool dudes. Yeah,
well, they still are. We're all very envious as we see them taking off and flying off. Also watching the trackers as they all fly over the Mediterranean and things like that. So your wife Jo, she's a balloonist as well, I believe. Is that right?
She is. Yep.
And did you meet through ballooning, or did she become a pilot later on?
No, I think she thought I was so into ballooning that she thought, if you can't beat them, join them. So it was quite interesting because it wasn't our first marriage for either of us. And when Jo and I got together, it was kind of '89, I suppose, just when commercial ballooning was just starting, and there was also a recession, and so my company wasn't doing that great, and I brought my sister in to work with me, actually. And one day I kind of said to my sister, well, look, I tell you what, you run the company, I won't take any more money out of it, I'm going to go ballooning. And so I started ballooning full time then. And when Jo and I got married in 1990, it was one of those times when we kind of worked together and everything, and we just thought, you know what, perhaps the pursuit of money in life is not quite as important as the pursuit of happiness. And we made a conscious effort just to say, to heck with the money, we'll just enjoy ourselves. And so we both got into ballooning. Well, I was already into it, of course, but we stopped passenger flying and we went on to the, what we call the show circuit. Mm-hmm. And of course, in the early 90s, it was the zenith of that particular era with all the special shapes, and it was just fabulous fun. And Joe and I used to live like a couple of gypsies. We had some, we had the Royal Mail had given us a balloon. They were sponsoring us at that time, and we had one from Land Rover, and we would just go off in our red postman's van with a balloon in the back, and every weekend we go to a different county show or a different event. And as I say, we lived like gypsies, but my goodness, we had a lot of fun.
I think everybody needs to do that once in their life, is go on tour and just enjoy that side of it, become nomad. Yeah. I did that in the 90s as well, and flew and tethered in places you'd never think of putting a balloon in, but it was certainly made it a lot more interesting than just flying the same area every time.
Yeah, indeed.
So I guess we're in the 90s, so maybe we should jump into when you started getting involved in some of these bigger endeavours around the world attempts. I guess in the mid to late 90s was when that all suddenly came to the forefront and everybody was trying to be the first. How did you get involved initially in some of these around the world pursuits that people were doing?
Well, in the mid 90s, there was a guy. There is a guy called Andy Elson who was a balloonist, and Andy has always been a little bit crazy. So he flew a balloon over Everest with Chris Dewhurst, and we formed. He and another friend, Dave Seeger Thomas, and I formed a company called High Profile Balloons, and we sort of pooled the contracts we had. And as a company, we had, I think, 3 ballooning contracts then. And so if we wanted anything really stupid done, like world records or tethered in 20-something knot winds, then we would send Andy out to do it because
he wouldn't say no.
he was that kind of pilot. Yeah, we'll have a go at that sort of thing. And then Andy got involved with Camerons when they were building the round the world balloons as a designer. And so Andy was working with the Breitling project on Breitling Orbiter 1 in 96, 97. And that had a fairly ignominious failure because it took off from Switzerland, flew for 6 and a bit hours, and plonked down in the Mediterranean Sea with a massive fuel leak on board. And Andy was kind of a bit in the firing line because this was a very expensive project and everybody looked pretty stupid. But they were going to go ahead with Breitling Orbiter 2, so another go. But also there was some concern that the pilots may not have been that well prepared for the kind of situations in terms of survival that they found themselves in. So Andy asked me to come in to the Breitling team, as a friend, so I could watch his back or try to, help him, if you like, overcome the issues that they created with Orbiter 1, but also with a military background. I had quite a lot of contacts, but also a lot of training in survival techniques and that sort of thing. So I did some training with the pilots and organized things like hypoxia training with the Air Force, crew resource management training, parachute stuff, and survival dinghy drills, that kind of stuff.
I was about to say, did you just keep chucking them into the sea in the middle of winter to test them out?
Well, it was funny because partway through, there's another little story there in Orbiter 3 actually, but perhaps you can remind me of it when we get there. But
feel free to jump around. This is going to be is the nature of the podcast, so go for it. We will forget.
Yeah. Okay. So, with Orbiter 3, Andy by that time had gone, and he was concentrating on his own project, cable and wireless project, because Orbiter 2 had also failed. I mean, they got to Burma, for Myanmar, which was a pretty amazing flight. They had a couple of world records then, but in terms of getting around the world, it was a fairly hopeless. Well, they hadn't got halfway, if you like. And things had got a little bit tense between Breitling and Andy, and he saw the writing on the wall and decided to jump ship. So he went off and did his own balloon, doing the cable and wireless around the world effort. And then I took over as project manager for Breitling Orbiter 3. And I was doing what we decided on Orbiter 3 was that if there was anything involved with safety, then we would actually share it with our competitors. Because I was based at Cameron's in Bristol, in the gas section, which was a separate building, but nevertheless, people sort of thought I was linked to Cameron's, although I was just a consultant, just working on the round the world balloon. So we invited all of the participants in the round the world flying, all the pilots, over to Bristol for a training course on survival stuff. The use of parachutes at high altitude, oxygen systems, survival drills in sea survival, jungle survival, cold survival, that kind of stuff.
That must have been a cast of characters you had there.
Yeah, absolutely it was. And I just remember one of the guys, Troy Bradley, who stood out because we had probably 8, I suppose, on the course. And so we ran this course for a couple of days, and what we decided that we would put them out one night on some hills near Bristol, and with nothing but a parachute, and they would have to make themselves a shelter and sort out their own water and food and that kind of stuff. And I remember we put them out there, and I was checking up on them every few hours, and I went out just after sort of midnight-ish, I think, and found them where they'd made their shelters and had a look at them. And Troy was cooking, garden slugs.
Yes.
Well, Troy had managed to find about 12 slugs. I mean, these black, brown, slimy things. And he'd put them in a billy can, and he was cooking them. And I looked at this mess in the billy can. I said, Troy, what are you doing? He said, well, we've got to eat. And I said, you're only out here for a night, for God's sake. As long as you got water, you don't have to worry about food probably for 3 weeks in a survival situation. And I said, I can't believe you're even thinking of eating that. But it was just something that stood out in my mind. And I always remember it when I see him.
Having met Troy, I'm not surprised, actually. I'm sure it gave him a good story to continue to tell.
I mean, it was quite disgusting. But he didn't eat, I have to add. He didn't.
Oh, it's all about the practice and going through the motions, of course.
Yeah, but that was good, and I think that most people appreciated the fact that we were, making that possibility, available.
So in those early, with the Orbiter 1 and your involvement, obviously more hands-on with Orbiter 2, at any point were you wishing you were one of the pilots? Like, was it something that had crossed your mind?
No, not really. It was, I was completely into the project, of course, with Orbiter 2. It was just fascinating. And when it flew, I was one of the controllers. We have a control center set up in Geneva Airport, and of course it has to be manned 24 hours. So Alan Noble was the flight director, and I was his assistant. So he tended to run the control center in the day, and I did it at night. But that was a fascinating insight to just what it was like for the guys, trying to help them through difficult times and make sure that they'd done their checks without kind of giving them the feeling that they were being instructed from the ground or anything like that. So it was a very interesting time. And then when Orbiter 2 failed, off I went to Burma to retrieve it. And by the time it took me quite a while actually to get it back. By the time I got back, Andy had gone. Breitling had another meeting with Bertrand Piccard and Cameron's, and decided that they'd have a go with Breitling 3, and that would be the last attempt. and they asked me to be the project manager. And we hadn't selected a second pilot at that stage, and we had several names in the hat, from celebrities, TV personalities, sportsmen, Formula One racing driver. But at the end, sort of common sense prevailed, and we said, "Look, it's got to be a balloon pilot, for goodness' sake." So Tony Brown was selected. That's another British examiner at balloon examiner, ex Concorde flight engineer. So and he was active on Concorde at that stage. So it was from a marketing point of view, it was great for Breitling. So that was the pilot selection that we'd made, and then I had the bright idea that we should have a backup pilot, because we're taking off from Switzerland in midwinter, and all sorts of stuff can happen, illness, falls, whatever.
Yeah.
And so they said, "Oh God, it was hard enough to find a second pilot. Where the hell are we going to find a backup pilot?" And I said, "Well, I could do it." And they kind of, it was like a condescending pat on the head. And they said, "Yeah, fine. Yeah, okay, you can do it." And I think I was the only one that took it seriously, to be honest. And never dreaming that I would. Looking back on it, it might have been a pretty stupid thing to say. But, I didn't consider it an opportunity. Because I was managing the project, I just wanted the project to work, and was kind of it was just sensible to have a backup pilot, and the fact that they were bemoaning the fact that where we could find one, it just made sense for me to say, well, I'm a pilot, for goodness sake, I can do it. Never dreaming that I would actually go on it.
So you weren't out there trying to sabotage Tony's meals and things to get him sick so that you could get the...
No. That was particularly difficult, because when it came to a head, and Tony and Bertrand weren't, well, let's say they weren't natural friends. And clearly they had different ideas about what should happen. And it was relatively, we were within a week of flying if we had the weather slot. This was November 98, I suppose, and the weather window had opened. When they sort of fell out a bit, or started to fall out, and it was fairly obvious that if they flew together, they probably wouldn't get on terribly well. So that was not a good way. But so from the project manager's perspective, i.e. me, it was my job to make sure they did get on properly, and that they did have correct training, and they could overcome their difficulties. But then on the other hand, I was a backup pilot, and if Tony dropped out, I'd take his place. So it was I was sort of torn, let's say. So it was a bit difficult. So I just kept my mouth shut and thought, well, fate will dictate, and so it did. So when Tony decided to drop out, I was it.
So this is the bit that fascinates me, because I definitely have enough troubles getting my wife to come ballooning for a weekend and approaching that subject. How do you go home and say to Joe, I'm about to go and fly around the world?
Yeah. Well, need to go back a little bit, actually, because when I joined, when I became the project manager of Orbiter 3, a bit of nepotism. The first person I employed in the office was my wife. And the reason I did that was because I'd seen the whole Orbiter 2 thing, and realized that when you're running a project like this, you don't go home very much. You're working probably until 10 or 11 at night, and you've got to be in again the next morning at 8. So we wouldn't have seen much of each other. And of course, Jo was a balloon pilot, so she understood what was going on, and we needed somebody in the office. So she came in, she ran the office and did the purchasing and that kind of stuff. And so she was in the project, if you like. And with Breitling Orbiter 2, she was with me when it flew, when I was in the control center. So she had a pretty decent idea of what went on. But when it became quite clear that, Tony wasn't going to fly, it wasn't quite as difficult as simply going home and saying, by the way, guess what? The difficulty was, we were both in Switzerland then, and the decision hadn't been made, but it was obvious one night when Bertrand, Tony, and I had dinner, just three of us, and there was some arguing across the table, and it became quite obvious to me that things were going to have to change. And I went back up to, and it was quite late when we finished, must have been midnight, I suppose. And Joe was in bed back at the apartment in Switzerland, and I had a very cold walk up the hill, probably about half a mile, I suppose, to where we lived. And it was absolutely freezing. But my head was sort of spinning, and I'm thinking to myself, it's really stupid, but I'm thinking, do I ask her or do I tell her? So I woke her up and said, Joe, I think we need to talk. And
those conversations never go well
no,
if you open with that line.
But, she knew what it was all about, and she was extremely supportive. In fact, it's absolutely true, and it's the title. When I give a talk now, I use her comment as the title of my talk, because she said, well, there's only one thing that really worries me about this. And I said, what's that? She said, well, how do you get home if the world really is flat? So my talk these days is called What If the World is Flat? And that's based on Joe's comment.
There's a million questions I could ask you about the flight, and what we're going to do is in the podcast notes I've included the documentary YouTube video, which kind of covers the entire flight, so we probably don't need to go step by step through the entire things. So there's I guess a number of particular sort of questions and areas that I'd just be interested to get your take. In that video, the obviously all the preparations happening, but the launch looked fairly dramatic, and when you actually took off, you kind of looked like you went pretty fast. I was wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit about that morning or in Chateau Day when you were taking off and the whole preparations around that piece.
Sure, yeah. But it was, you can imagine the night before takeoff, we didn't sleep very well.
Yeah.
But our team, they started, I think, they started prepping the balloon the morning before, but they started putting helium into it about midnight, and it was just very cold and fairly calm night. And Bertrand and I, we woke up about 4:30, or got up, should I say, about 4:30. We both had breakfast in the hotel, which Bertrand promptly threw up again because he was a little nervous. We both were, I guess.
He was a veteran of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, third time. So, and we went down to the launch site, and I remember seeing this, just the most amazing sight, because they had these little helium balloon lights, where they put actually a light inside of a helium sphere, and it produces quite a lot of light, and the whole launch site was lit up by these things, these tiny little lit balloons on bits of string, and there was this massive, huge, great silver monster, which was just sitting there glistening in the light, and it just looked amazing. And we kind of stopped us in the tracks, and we thought, holy moly, we're going to fly that. And so anyway, we got on with our checks and stuff, and as the sun started to come up, closer to our launch time, we were still doing the checks, and unfortunately this valley wind picked up, the katabatic wind coming down the valley, started to get a bit gusty, and the balloons started blowing about a bit. And with these Rosier balloons, basically they fill them with helium until they get to a point of equilibrium where it's almost lifting off, just like a hot air balloon when you take your weight off from the basket and it wants to rise. And then Bertrand and I get in with some of our kit, and then of course they have to put more helium in to compensate for our weight. And I think because it was really difficult, the conditions, because it was blowing about, and the balloon was bouncing around. It was held on a tether to a fire truck, basically, a bit like a quick release, except it wasn't with no quick release fitted, but it was that kind of thing. And so it was bouncing about a bit on the launch site, and I think they put a bit too much helium in. So when eventually Alan Noble cut the rope to let us go, we went off pretty damn fast. And what was worrying was that there was a hot air balloon going to be flown by one of the Chateau Day pilots. It was going to take off 20 minutes before we were, to check out the winds as we climbed up through the valley. And they packed the balloon away, and they said it's too windy to fly.
Oh no! Your pieball walked away.
Exactly. Yeah. So the Silver Monster wasn't going to be put away. So we didn't really have a lot of choice. But so when we took off, it was a bit too quick in terms of too much helium. Now people kind of think, oh well, does that really matter very much? But you have to put it into context, because the year before, Steve Fawcett, Dick Rutan, and Dave Melton had gone off too fast, and their balloon had burst, because as the balloon goes up, of course, you put helium into the actual gas cell, and the helium's come from a liquid state into a gaseous state, so it's really cold. And then as you're climbing fairly fast, the air density is decreasing, the helium's expanding at a massive rate, because it's A, it's warming up, and B, it's getting into less dense air. So it's too efficient, if you like. And so you go up too fast, and Dave Melton, Dick Rutan's balloon burst at a couple of thousand feet, I think, and the gas cell ruptures inside with a huge bang, and they jumped out on parachutes. They were okay. I think Dave broke something or another, and then Kevin Uliassi did the same thing. He went off too fast, and he managed to get his balloon back on the ground. And then Steve Fawcett went too quick, but managed to get it under control. But all of these three guys, they were taking off either from, all in the States. So they weren't taking off in an alpine region as we were. So you can imagine if our balloon had burst, when we were carrying 5.5 tons of propane in the mountains. And if the balloon had burst, we would have been in deep stuff, I think. So when we did go off too fast and everybody went, ooh, they're going up quick, actually inside the capsule, it was pandemonium. I mean, it was sheer panic. Bertrand was screaming, no, let the helium go. So we'd opened both gas valves and the balloon, and then we stopped underneath an inversion. And well, okay, fine. So then we couldn't get through the inversion.
Of course,
so
yeah.
Then we had to ditch quite a bit of ballast and use the burner to get through it. So it was all a bit hectic. It probably took us. It must have been a good 20 minutes actually after takeoff before everything was checked, sealed, and we actually sat down and looked at each other in the capsule and thought, oh, good God.
Sorry for the interruption, but we hope you're enjoying this podcast. We thought we'd take advantage of the fact it's such a long episode by having an ad break in the middle. And today we're really going to just advertise ourselves. And we really are asking that everybody gets out there and shares Aunty Monkey on Facebook. Each time we post an episode, please like it, but also please share it if you can. The more people listening, the more support we'll have for the podcast. Anyway, that's enough of an interruption. We'll let you get back to the discussion with Brian Jones, and we pick it back up where he is launching from Chateau Day. How fast were you actually going up at the time?
To be honest, I don't know. I was standing on the outside of the capsule because I had some checks on top of the capsule to do, and I honestly don't know. I would have thought probably 700-800 feet a minute, something like that. Too fast for a Rosier, anyway.
I was about to say it's fast for a hot air balloon, but Yeah, for us racer flight pilots, doesn't sound fast, but I'm sure when you've got the complexity of a Rosier and that the very fragile fabric, that would be quick.
Yeah.
Just the balloon itself, how big was it? What was the size?
The whole thing was about 1 million cubic feet. So we had a gas cell which was 650,000 cubic feet inside the rubber gas cell, if you like, and then a hot air cone below it, and this sort of bubble on top, which gave it its odd shape, which was simply another little helium balloon to hold the fabric up to help with insulation.
And was it fundamentally different from the previous two balloons?
No, not really. It was fundamentally different in as much as one of the big decisions I had as project manager in the first month, I suppose, was, do we continue? Because Brightling Orbiter 1 and 2 was kerosene burners, and Brightling Orbiter 3 we decided to go to ditch all of that fuel system and go to propane.
Back to what you knew.
Yeah, exactly. Because, Andy Elson had been the specialist in kerosene, and he was sold on it, but we hated it. Dirty stuff, and you had to pump it, of course. But it had some advantages, of course. A, it wasn't explosively dangerous. B, you didn't have to put it in steel containers. And C, that it could be stored in rubber bags at the base of the capsule, so that the capsule would give a good flotation device. So if the capsule went into water, it floats nicely. Whereas once we decided to go to propane, we really messed that system up, because we had to hang our tanks from a huge titanium frame that we had to build on top of the capsule to hang the tanks from. So I guess the center of gravity must have gone upwards by probably 3 or 4 feet. So there was no way that the capsule would float nicely if we put it in the water. It would invert, no question. It would simply go upside down. We couldn't, if we were in a survival situation in the water, we'd have to leave the capsule. We couldn't stay with it.
And you were dropping tanks as you were going, weren't you?
Yeah. Yeah, not terribly proud of that, but it was just a necessity. It was just one of those things you had to do.
I'm sure you're holding your breath as you're looking down and wondering what was going to happen below.
Well, we chose, of course, where to put them, and we were very fortunate, actually. We decided that the number of tanks that we had designed for the capsule was 28, and our meteorologist said to us, look, when you take off, for the first day or so, you don't need to go higher than 26,000 feet. So we were able then, because we didn't need to go very high, we were able to put 4 extra tanks on, which was our savior, really. So we took 32. But the problem was that we had automatic systems for releasing the 28, but the extra 4 that we put on, we had to physically cut. We had to cut away, and we cut those away in the Sahara Desert. So we knew we could see the ground, and we could see them fall when we dropped them. But all the other tanks we dropped in the ocean.
But what sort of height were you dropping down to do that?
I think when we dropped them in the Sahara, we dropped down to about 3,000 or 4,000 feet. But there were times over the Pacific where we were dropping them at 30,000 feet. So as long as we could see the water below us.
Here's the thing that fascinates me about this is, I get bored after 2 hours in a balloon basket. So you're in there for 20 days with Bertrand, locked in a box. I believe there was one period where you were in there for 3 days straight in a pressurized capsule at height. How do you not go insane over 20 days locked in the box?
Yeah, it's I kind of wonder that sometimes, but looking back on it, it's an odd thing, but we completely lost all sense of timing. I mean, we knew what day it was and stuff, but we got into a routine. You see, we weren't together all the time because we had no autopilot, so one of us had to physically fly the balloon all the time, and so we would do shifts, really. The idea was that we do 8-hour shifts. One would sleep for 8 hours, then swap over to the other one, and we'd spend 8 hours together. Didn't quite work out like that, but generally speaking, so we were only in each other's company, if you like, for say 16 hours a day. But it was, as I say, we just lost sense of time, and you just concentrated on where you were, what the balloon was doing, flying the balloon, and the time just flew by. We went through an awful lot there, of course, in 3 weeks, but generally speaking, there was no boredom. We'd taken some books and some music, on an, I was going to say, there weren't such thing in those days. It was Sony Walkmans, I think. So we'd taken some music, taken some books. Neither of us looked at a book the whole 20 days, and I think Bertrand only once put music on. It was just so intense the whole time. It was just so busy. Air traffic, radio work. During the day when we were working together, one of us would operate the radio, the other would fly the balloon and do the navigation. So we were just always busy, and it was a great time actually. And the balloon was initially a real pig to fly, of course. And it was just for me, it was an amazing sense of achievement. In fact, I always look back at it first. I always say it, but I look back on it. The best time of the flight for me was probably about day 10, when I realized for the first time that I was flying this balloon and it wasn't flying me. And I got to grips with it. And I think by the end of the flight, I honestly felt that I could make that balloon dance if I wanted to, just like, when you're flying a hot air balloon and you've got a couple of thousand hours under your belt, sort of thing, you can make it do whatever you want it to do.
And then knowing that you probably never get a chance to use those skills again.
Well, actually, no, that didn't. It's weird. I'd never thought like that. It was just a constant, this is what we've got to do. We've got to make sure that, we stay alive, and make sure that we fly the balloon to the very best of our ability.
So the staying alive piece, again, watching the video, there's a lot of the dramatic moments of whether it was politics or fuel failures or icing, etc. During those days, what were the actual moments where you thought, A, this isn't going to happen, and B, we're in some serious shit here? This could be a big problem. What were the sort of key moments that occurred for you?
Well, I should say that I never really thought that we would do it. Probably not until halfway across the Atlantic on the inbound leg. I always really hoped that we could get across the Pacific. And I just thought, if we could do that, we would have smashed every world record, if you like, for ballooning, and it would have been just the most fantastic flight to have gone from Switzerland right across the Pacific. And the whole fuel system thing was incredibly difficult to work out, how much fuel you'd use at different altitudes and that sort of stuff. So it's fair to say that I never thought we would actually achieve it. I just wanted to do the very best that we could. The difficult times, there were just so many, really.
Okay.
There were. We had a lot of failures. Very early on, our tank weighing system completely packed up and it was hopeless. So we didn't have any idea with regard to how much fuel we had left in any tank. So we operated a system where we simply timed the tanks, and we would be very careful about which tank we were using at any one time. We'd make sure that we just used that one. We knew exactly the time we turned it on, and we knew the time it ran out. And so that was the kind of, that tank lasted 11 and a half hours. So, 11 and a half hours times 28 is what we've got, sort of thing.
And were you flying just single tank, like on a single tank each time, or do you have multiple ones?
Actually, it was a pair.
Yeah.
Tanks were arranged in pairs, so yeah, we would fly a single pair at any one time until they'd run out. And we kept really careful records of that on our flight log. So that was one of the issues. We had to be really careful with the fuel. The pilot lights didn't work once we got above about 15,000 feet. And it wasn't the fact that they were lousy pilot lights, it was simply the fact that we hadn't, the one thing that we weren't able to test, and nobody, including the engineers, had even thought about, was the fact that because you're traveling up there with the wind, and you're burning propane, you're creating water vapor and moisture, of course.
Yeah.
And normally aeroplanes leave it in a nice, beautiful white line behind them, but we were going the same speed as the wind, therefore we were taking our contrails with us. And there was just this constant steam around the burners, which then condensed at night and froze at night and caused ice everywhere. I mean, everything was covered in ice. And it played havoc with all kinds of things. Our electrical systems on the outside of the balloon were just completely knackered quite quickly. We would lose a couple of burners because the solenoids wouldn't work, so we'd have to climb out by and smack the solenoid with a hammer or wrap a chemical hand warmer around it, that kind of stuff to get it working again. So we had no pilot lights. And so what I was able to do, because I knew probably a lot more than Bertrand about the burners, simply because I've been in the workshop when they were built and tested and everything else. And Bertrand was much better at me at communicating with press and that kind of stuff. So he manned the sat phone during the day, and at night I would be on duty and I would run the burners. So we managed a system whereby we had little timers on the burners, and I could adjust the height of the flame and that kind of stuff. So we adjusted it so that, and it took about the first hour, I suppose, of darkness to get it working properly. But what we did is we would use the burners, let the flame come up, and then as the flame diminished, we would time it so that the next firing of the fuel would actually coincide with the flame just before it went out. And so you were catching the residual flame, if you like, and burning just for a couple of seconds. So that was quite.
I now know what was occupying you for the 20 days.
yeah. And then it was quite. Well, it wasn't amusing at all. Actually, it was quite scary, and it certainly scared Bertrand because it woke him up. But if you missed it, so then the light went out, so you'd be firing gas into there with no pilot light, and then you'd get this the emergency sparker, which was remote controlled, by the way. Yeah. So you'd hit the button for the sparker, and then suddenly that would ignite, and then there'd be this big whoomp because all the unburnt propane in the balloon suddenly caught with a boom. The balloon would sort of jump with the and Bertrand will wake up and stick his head out the curtain and say, "What's going on?" But so that was. Yeah, it was busy.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think early on when I had a Rosier balloon described to me, I think I always thought it was a gas balloon during the day and a hot air balloon at night. But the more I learned about it, was actually, no, you're flying this thing as basically a hot air balloon the whole way. Well, actually, one of the questions I wanted to go back to you about was Chateau Day as a choice of launch site. I mean, obviously there was the Swiss connection with all the organisers and the sponsors and Bertrand, etc. It seemed like a strange place to be taken out of. You mentioned before the complexities of the katabatic winds and the mountains, and if things went wrong, you were in a mountainous area. In hindsight, was it a good choice of launch site?
Not really.
Should have been in Northern Australia.
Well, yeah, obviously, Northern would have been ideal, but it had its pros and cons, really. I mean, it was always assumed that we would go from Chateau Day. We had our workshop there, and everything kind of worked okay there. We had a lot of people in Chateau Day who knew all about balloons, so you use the locals as security, and the locals would come and help, and the local pilots would come out and help, and they all knew what they were doing, and nobody did anything stupid. So you had lots of help. You had the Swiss mentality for work. So, if you needed a crane in an hour and a half, you'd get a crane in an hour and a half. You try to do that in Morocco or southern Spain, and you got a problem on your hands, So that was positive. And of course, when we decided that Switzerland would be the launch site, the Iraq was not at war, and so that posed a bit of a problem for us as well. From the Middle East, so you couldn't fly a straight line, if you like, from Switzerland to India, because you had to avoid the Middle East situation in Iraq.
I guess it wasn't too bad a place to live as well while you're waiting for your weather slot.
Yeah, that's right. And it was we just accepted it. It was one of those things. It certainly wasn't worth considering moving launch site. We didn't think, and as it turned out, of course, it was the right thing to do.
A big question is, I think there was probably 21 other attempts prior to yourselves doing this one.
Yeah.
What do you think was fundamentally different with your attempt that made it successful? Was it good luck, or was it something else at play?
I think it was. There's a lot of luck. Yeah, of course there is. But we were always seen as the outsiders, but that was to people that didn't know. And if you were a balloonist, you'd be nuts not to put your money on a team of two pretty decent balloonists, instead of somebody like Richard Branson. Yeah. And Per, of course, is great, but they have other agendas as well. Whereas we had a single, solitary, agenda, which was to do our very best to make this balloon work. And Bertrand and I got on well, and we'd left. There was no ego in the balloon capsule at all. We sort of left any ego we had in the car park. And I just think that any person with any knowledge looking in from the outside would have actually probably, if you're going to have a bet, you put your money on the Breitling team. Not many people did, of course, but so I think that was a major contributing factor. That, we knew. I say we knew our balloon. I knew that balloon inside out. I knew every nut and bolt that had gone into it. I knew every system. We worked really hard to learn that. We had a good professional approach. We didn't argue at all, and I just think that, and yes, we were lucky. We probably had the best meteorologist in the world, with the Trilliums, which was incredibly important. We had 3 full-time professional air traffic controllers working just on our project, just to try to clear the airspace ahead of us, and they did the most amazing job too. So we had. I'm absolutely convinced we had the best team in not just the pilots but the whole thing, and I think that if anybody deserved it, it sounds a bit supercilious, but if anybody deserved it, I think we did.
I think the ballooning community would agree. From the outsides watching in, everyone makes jokes about there are billionaires up there paying for a commercial balloon flight around the world, where I think we were all quietly hoping that the balloonists would get the glory. So, yeah,
Steve Fawcett turned out to be a good friend, and I spent quite a lot of time with him until unfortunately died. But what I thought was really sad was on the first interview when Steve was, after he'd done his flight, he said, "Thank God I never have to get in a balloon again." Yeah. And I thought, yeah, that does an awful lot for the sport, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah, maybe you could have clarified that being a Rosier flying around the world, but
yes.
Yeah. When you cross that line, and it's a fascinating piece of video watching your reactions to having just achieved it. I mean, I guess I can sort of guess that you know, it's a bit like climbing Everest. You get to the top, but you know, there's still a long way to go to get down again. What went through your minds at that moment?
Well, it was. I mean, of course, it was a special moment. It was I wouldn't say it was spoiled, but it was affected by the fact that that was when I suppose other people's agendas started to kick in. And so from the ground, we had this message to say, you know, what you're about to do is an incredibly important, you know, historical aviation moment, and make sure you've got your brightening gear on, and make sure that you know, you don't swear at the camera, and make sure you got your cameras running and all the rest of it. So in a sense, it was just a little bit false, because we knew that we had a camera running inside and that this would be sort of important. It wasn't staged, but we were just aware of the camera running. So, you know, I suppose if there had been no cameras, my language would have been a little bit more colourful.
So you're trying to work out your stepping on the moon, you know, one-liner that could be used for the rest of time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but in actual fact, it was quite amusing, because we suddenly got confused with. I mean, we've been using GPS for 19 days, and then suddenly we got confused by it, and we couldn't work out the exact moment, and we were trying to think of, well, because we're going west now, so is the longitude decreasing or increasing, and should we be at, you know, 9 degrees and 26 minutes, or should we be at 9 degrees and 27 minutes? And there was this confusion, which actually shows in the film. But when we realised we'd done it, it was, I mean, it was, of course, it was joyful, and that was genuine, obviously.
And watching your landing, I mean, you said you'd worked out how to fly the balloon, but you obviously hadn't landed one.
Yeah,
yet.
Exactly. Yeah,
it looked like a good bounce.
It was a hell of a bounce. It was a terrible landing, actually, because, well, I got two chances. The second landing was quite good, but the first bounce was up to about, I think it was about 800 feet we bounced. Oh. In my defense, I'd never flown one of these before. Basically, what we were going to do is we were going to fly it a bit like a hot air balloon. We had this kind of body armor that we'd done in, you know, the stuff, the thick rubber stuff they use on the basket floor. Yep. When they make a basket. Well, we'd made some body armor out of that, and we were going to be standing up in the, or one of us, whoever was doing the landing, me, was going to be standing up in the hole in the top of the capsule and actually fly it down like a hot air balloon. But there was really nowhere to balance. And so that was the original plan. And then the secondary plan was that if it was windy, we would actually strap ourselves in the bunk, and we had a firing mechanism which would separate the envelope from the capsule. We'd strap ourselves in the bunk, and we'd fire the mechanism when we felt the first bang, and get rid of the balloon. In the end, it all got a bit fraught, and we didn't do any of that. We just we stood up in the capsule. I realized that I'm needing to operate, I'm needing to look at the instruments whilst I'm operating the lines, because, isn't it typical, we've got no turning vents and the balloon's going backwards.
Of course.
You know, we're facing the wrong way. And there was absolutely nothing we could do about that. So I can't see out at all. So I'm just looking for instruments. And anyway, we hit the ground a little bit too hard initially, and bounced. And then we got to grips with it, and the second one was a bit better.
Oh, well done. The moment of you standing in the middle of this barren wasteland of desert, I guess, is that when it really all started sinking, when you're on your own away from the radios and just you could have your moment? Yeah, it was pretty amazing. On the descent, we set off our emergency locator beacons, so we were transmitting on 1215, and our not ADFB, our transponder was
was transmitting the emergency squawk code. So we were hoping that they'd know where we were. And in fact, Breitling people had come out from Switzerland. They'd taken a private jet, and they'd found us. They'd homed in on our emergency beacon. So actually, when we landed, they were circling above us, and then they flew off. And then we were reliant on the Egyptians getting us, and that wasn't quite so straightforward. But when we got out of the capsule, we were completely alone, and it was just amazing. I mean, I can still picture that moment where, I mean, there was just nothing. I mean, there was no birds. There wasn't even any flies. I mean, nothing in the desert. It was just a flat, barren landscape of sand and little stones and nothing. And which was bad for me, because I thought, okay, the first thing I need to do is get back in the capsule and send a message to our control center that everything was okay. So I went back in and I sent this fax message, and it just came out, and it was absolutely not original. I just said, the eagle has landed, all okay, bloody good, you know, because it's really weird, and I wasn't consciously thinking of it, but obviously, you know, when I was a teenager and they'd landed, Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and that I'd stayed up all night, of course, to watch that on the TV at 4 a.m, when at the time it was, and it was, I mean, there were such kind of heroes of mine, if you like, but it just came out, and afterwards, when people said, well, that wasn't very original, was it? I thought, oh, no, absolutely right. What a dope. But it was just, that was an emotion. It wasn't words that I'd chosen. It was simply an emotion that came out because it looked just like the moon, you know, and it was quite amazing.
You didn't step out and then go and plant a flag into the landscape as well, did you?
No, we washed our hair.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, there's a great video, and I thought, wow, he must have been confident he was going to be picked up because he just used all their drinking water to wash his hair.
I mean, you can imagine it was a little bit itchy, I have to say. I mean, 3 weeks up there and we hadn't washed our hair. I mean, we were pretty clean because we'd used wet wipes and stuff to clean ourselves, but we couldn't wash hair, and it was pretty horrible.
I can imagine it would smell pretty rank in the capsule too by the end of that time.
Well, I don't know, actually. I don't think it did smell. Well, we wouldn't have noticed anyway. But, you know, on a daily basis, we would get these wet wipes out and wipe down completely, like a sponge bath, if you like. But yeah, the washing the hair moment was really funny because our water, our drinking water, had all frozen when we were at altitude. And so when we were coming in on the approach, of course, we had the bottle that we'd been using for our drinking water was out, and these were 1.5 litre bottles of water. And the one we'd been using was sort of in the sink, in the little kitchenette thing. So I knew which one it was. So when we got out and said, oh, God, I could really do with washing my hair, and Bertrand said, yeah, fine, okay, well, let's do it, and I'll hold the bottle of water for you, and you can help me. But for me, I got this bottle out of the sink, which of course had been out for quite a while and was not ice cold. It was cold, but not ice cold. So when Bertrand poured it over my head to wash out the soap, it was, not unpleasant. And then it was his turn, and I got the bottle of which had been ice out from under the floor. I think that was the first time I was a bit cruel to him in 3 weeks. So I just poured the stuff on his head, and he jumped like there's no tomorrow.
The first man to get hypothermia in the desert.
Exactly, yeah.
Then I'm guessing the whirlwind happened in terms of media and activities and meeting and people receiving. And if you look at your website, there must be 40, 50 awards that you've received since. What did that look like, and what were some of the people you got to meet as part of the celebrations afterwards?
How long have you got?
Give me the highlights, or the ones that meant the most to you.
It was just fabulous. I mean, it truly was. it was just a whole whirlwind, as you say, of meeting people and awards and people telling us how wonderful we were. And first class travel, limousines, top hotels. I mean, it was real celebrity. And it doesn't last very long. And I think I was quite lucky. Well, Bertrand too, actually. But I always felt that I was quite lucky that I was 52 years old. So I kind of knew that it wouldn't last. And I just enjoyed it whilst it was there. And we had an absolute ball. I mean, I got back to the UK on a Thursday, and on the Saturday it was the centenary of the Explorers Club in New York, and they said, you must be here for our centenary. We'd like to honour you as our guests. And we said, well, we can't, we just don't have time. And they said, leave it to us. And so they fixed up with British Airways, so we got the Concorde flight. I still got my seat ticket, which was 1A on Concorde. And in those days, it was before 9/11, of course, so sure. I was on the flight deck for takeoff and landing. It was just amazing. And then we got to the Explorers Club in New York, which was our very first event. I sat next to John Glenn. It was just totally surreal. And but I mean, that was just the start of it, and then it just carried on in that vein for quite a few months, actually.
Well, I mean, looking at some of the photos on your site, you've got the Queen, you've got presidents, you've got all sorts of people in there shaking your hand.
Yeah. I mean, the royalty, yes, the Queen I met 3 or 4 times, Duke of Edinburgh numerous times because he was patron of so many of these flying institutions that were giving me stuff. I've got to know Prince Edward quite well. I had lunch. A very nice lunch with his wife, Sophie Wessex, with just 6 having a long lunch, and she was just charming. The astronauts, I met most of the astronauts that you could think of, including all 3 Apollo 11, so Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Mike Collins. They're all in my address book, not Neil anymore, of course, because he's gone. But, Chris Hadfield I had lunch with a couple of years ago, actually, after his trip to the International Space Station. I knew Gene Cernan reasonably well. I met Jim Lovell of Apollo 13. I mean, just the list is endless, as you say, presidents and King Philip, Belgium, and Prince Albert in Monaco, and Bill Clinton, President Clinton asked me for my autograph. Both of us. So we autographed we were on the front cover of National Geographic when we were out in the States, and we met Clinton, and he had a copy, and he asked us to sign it, which is pretty amazing, really.
And now you're talking to an Australian on Aunty Monkey. Gee, I feel honoured.
Yeah, and it is a bit surreal, and I mean, I could go on name dropping forever more almost, but it's just such a privilege to meet some of these people. And what is so good about doing that is that you meet them, and when you're talking to them, you realise that they're just people, and that they have heroes of their own, and they're completely genuine. And I mean, I was tongue-tied completely when Neil Armstrong, Bertrand, and I went out for a drink together. Just 3 of us went for a beer in a bar in New York, and we were just sitting, and my mouth just kept dropping out. And he was just such a charming man. He was just fabulous.
Well, I've often heard that the more distinguished and the more important the person, the less of the ego they tend to have, because they've achieved things. Yeah. So they're not trying to achieve things.
Yeah, I think so.
As a result of doing this, you received $1 million, and I'm very happy to read and know that you didn't just go and buy yourself a nice car and bank it away. Maybe if you could sort of share some of the opportunities that opened up for you in terms of your charity work and things you have done since.
Yeah, well, Bertrand and I, when we were flying over Africa, I mean, I won't repeat it, it's in the book, it's a lovely story, actually, of when we kind of realised that the fragile nature of this amazing planet, and some of the kids that are suffering needlessly and just awful. Anyway, so we decided that we wanted to do something clearly, and so the $1 million went to start our foundation, the Winds of Hope. And at that time, Bertrand and I weren't quite sure how we would organise it, but it evolved, and we found this disease called NOMA, which is a kind of, it's a bit like cancer of the face, to be honest. It's disfiguring, the face just rots. It's just horrible. It affects children between the ages generally of 2 and 10, something. So there were hundreds of thousands of these children in Africa dying from this, and it was so appalling. And because the disease is a little bit like gangrene of the face, I suppose, that the smell is just appalling. The flesh is rotting. It looks, you can imagine how bad it looks. And so a lot of these kids, it's just assumed that they've been cursed. So, they're just hidden away. I mean, not even taken to hospital. Their parents are ashamed of them or think they've been cursed. And it's just the most horrible thing. So we found that quite by chance, actually. And we decided that what we would like to do is we'd set up Winds of Hope with the aim of trying to eradicate this disease within our lifetime. I suspect we're not going to do it because it's Africa, but we'll give it a darn good try.
And what's your involvement with that now? Is that been an ongoing thing for the last 20 years?
Yeah, it is. I have to say, regretfully, that I tend to be just a fundraiser these days. It's run from Switzerland, and I'm not in Switzerland that often. So Bertrand and his wife and his brother-in-law and we've got a full-time CEO now as well. So they're running the charity from Switzerland. So they do all the hard work, the meetings and stuff. And I'm much less hands-on these days, but I still fundraise for it.
I'll put some links up in the show notes just so people can find some more information about that and how they can get involved. Yeah. And so then, sorry, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah, you go.
No, I was just going to say, because of my almost lack of involvement, and I do feel awful about it, but there's nothing I can do about it. I'm in the UK and it runs from Switzerland. So I wanted to get involved in something over here, so I got involved in disabled flying. So I'm an ambassador for a British charity, British Disabled Flying Association. I'm president of a charity in Switzerland for Handy Flight, it's called, for disabled pilots. And now I run, I started my own project to try to train disabled people to fly balloons.
And that must be so fulfilling. I mean, I chatted to Michael Glenn on one of the earliest podcasts we did, and just hearing him talk about being able to have that sense of freedom when you're confined to a wheelchair. From an outsider or as a pilot, it must be so satisfying being able to share some of that experience with them.
Absolutely. I mean, I met Michael, I think back in about 2008, in both Albuquerque and Reno at the balloon meets there. And I mean, he was just inspirational, really. He's, typical Americans, got a lot to say, but all the stuff he does say.
He drinks a lot of beer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I mean, this guy had, overcome his disability in terms of flying a balloon. He worked out how to do it, and when I met him, he was taking passengers in a dual chair. And I thought then, because he was saying, "Well, I'm the only disabled balloon pilot in the world," I'm thinking, why? Why should that be? It doesn't make any sense. And so I was lucky enough. I mean, I've been sponsored by Breitling for 18 years or so, and I have a really good relationship with the company, and I had this thought then that I'd like to train disabled people to fly balloons, because flight training is kind of in my blood, if you like, and instruction. And so I asked Breitling, and they said yeah. So they bought the balloon for me, dual chair, with turning vents, with fast deflation system. I mean, it's the bee's knees for disabled training.
Yeah.
And so I've just trained my 6th disabled pilot. And initially the idea was to try to float this out there and get it going throughout Europe, but it's been a heck of a lot slower than I thought. And it's not easy. Although I have done a presentation to every British balloon instructor, I've given them a presentation through the instructor training system about training disabled people, and I've written an addendum to the pilot training manual for disabled people. But it's hard to do it in the UK. I mean, conditions over here are really not really suitable, winds and stuff, and so it's evolved. And now we've set up a training centre in northern Italy, and I'm thinking that I might actually base the balloon out there permanently, and anybody who wants to train, the balloon is sitting there waiting for them, plus instructors, and because there's 2 instructors in Mondovì in Italy that are that have British instructor ratings. So, and I've flown with them a lot and talked about disabled flight training, and so I'm thinking of setting that there as a centre, and hopefully if other people get involved, that would be wonderful. But if they don't, at least there's a situation where disabled people can go to train.
No, that's great. And I think that there's certainly some interest out here in Australia about doing something similar. So out here, there's a number of people who are flying with baskets with doors in them so they can take passengers in wheelchairs, but no one's really doing the actual training of pilots in such a situation. So we'll certainly reach out to you about that, so if we can do something.
Well, I mean, the most extraordinary thing is, well, it's not extraordinary if you think about it, but it is to experience it, which is when a disabled person gets off of their wheelchair and sits on the seat next to me, and we take off, and I give them control of the balloon, we are exactly the same. There is no difference. You don't need legs. The fact that they're sitting there, they do everything I do. And the feeling for them, it's so emotional, it brings tears to the eyes sometimes. I mean, that feeling of freedom, that feeling of equitability, if you like, they're equal to everybody else. Able, disabled doesn't really make any difference when you're up there. You're just an aviator.
Yep. And I think that was what Michael was saying in his podcast, that he was always saying, except for when he was flying a racer in a chariot. And that was certainly when he felt he had to be a bit more brave than some of the other pilots.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess the final question for you is, what's next for yourself? What's your next adventure or your next ambition in ballooning or outside of ballooning?
Well, I'm a bit of an old codger these days. I'm
so
70 years old.
You're the average age of a balloonist then.
And it's not easy. I've just given up commercial flying. I've given up my commercial examining, although I've kept on the PPL side of things. And I threw my toys out of the pram recently. In the UK, we're going through this the whole of Europe actually going through this EASA, European rules. Mm-hmm. And I've had some very direct arguments with the powers that be, and I really got very surety about it, and which is one of the reasons I handed in my CPL thing. Right. It's just a stand, but I mean, to me, the British system of balloon instruction, I believe, is the best in the world. And now we're adopting a system whereby a 14-year-old will be allowed to fly solo before he's checked out. And I just said to our CAA, you've got to be out of your mind. Mm-hmm. This is just nonsense. Oh, but it's the law. It's the law. I said, well, that's no excuse. It's just stupid. So anyway, I won't stand on my soapbox.
I was about to say you're going to end the podcast on a political note. Great.
yeah. But it is. It's sheer stupidity in my book, anyway. And I think ballooning is going backwards with the result of EASA rules.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it affects me because I'm 70 years old and I can't fly commercially, but over the age of 70. So you lose your commercial examiner's ticket. And it's not just me. I mean, there's quite a few of us. Phil Dunnington is the same age as me, and so a lot of Kevin Meehan and loads. And so all this experience is being chucked out of the window, if you like, and you think this can't be right. It's kind of knowledge, and when you get older, the knowledge and experience you have actually joins in with old age, and you get a little bit of wisdom as well with all that. And I just think that us oldies have got a huge amount still to offer in terms of training and examining. And it's just crazy that we should be pushed out.
It goes back to your point at the start where, in the early days, it was people who were still working it out for themselves, teaching other people how to do it.
Yeah.
Where, same thing's happening. And on the adventurous piece, you called your book and the video was The Last Great Adventure. Are there other adventures that you think that are possible in ballooning? Obviously, we've had recently, people are trying to break the speed record for flying around the world now with Fedor and the Russian. What else do you think is out there that people can strive towards?
Well, I think there are always personal goals. Now, maybe the big ones have gone, particularly around the world. But, it doesn't get any easier just because we've done it. And technology is 20 years more modern. But believe me, it's no easier today to fly a balloon around the world. In fact, in the Northern Hemisphere, it's more difficult than it ever was. And I'll just correct you, if I may, on one thing. Our publisher wanted to call the book The Last Great Adventure, and we said, absolutely not. And they'd actually printed the cover of it, and we said, I'm sorry, you're going to have to reprint because that's not acceptable. That's just an arrogance to say it's The Last Great Adventure. So it's called The Greatest Adventure.
Oh, sorry, I apologize, yes.
And at the end of the book, I think it's Bertrand who says, the greatest adventure is not actually flying a balloon around the world. It's the personal adventure that one goes on.
Well, thank you. I've taken a lot of your time today, but it's been a great pleasure. When we came up with the podcast, there was certainly 3 or 4 people that we had at the top of the list of that we wanted to include, and you were certainly right up there. So we greatly appreciate you being involved in this. And what we will do is I'm going to provide a lot of the links to the videos and your website and your charities so people can get involved. But,
okay.
From the bottom of my heart, thank you very much for not only being involved in the podcast, but just all the things that you've done for ballooning. It's been great.
Well, it's been my pleasure.
Thank you very much, Brian.
Okay, thanks, Andy. All the best.
Hi, it's Andrew here again. Just a quick reminder, please get out there and share Aunty Monkey on Facebook. The more support we get from you guys to share the content and get more people listening to the podcast, the better. Also, if you have any suggestions of people that we could include on episodes, please let us know. You can contact us through auntymonkey.com. There's links to our email or the Facebook page through the website. Anyway, until next episode, see you later.